Good evening. I guess we can start, and then whoever is late can join us. Welcome to this digital event of Vashem. My name is Rocco Giansante, and I'm the head of the Italian desk at the International School for Holocaust Studies. And tonight I'm going to be the moderator of the evening. Tonight it's a very special evening here in Israel because it's Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. The commemorations just started tonight and will continue until tomorrow evening. Is this very appropriate that we dedicate this evening to the reflection on the construction of the memory of
perché mi ha telefonato Sofia dicendo che
sorry. So I was saying that it's very appropriate that we dedicate this evening to the reflection on the construction of Shoah memory in society, and also to the role of memory in the contemporary. And then in order to do this, we've invited a special guest, the French-German author and journalist, Géraldine Schwarz. But before we start, I would like to hand over the microphone to Daniela Dana Tedeschi, who is the president of the association Figli della Shoah, Children of the Shoah, an association that was established in 1998 in Milan by Holocaust survivors and second generation. The association Figli della Shoah is a partner in the creation of this event. Daniela, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Buonasera. I saw there were a lot of Italians and friends, so happy to see you, and good evening. So good evening and welcome also to Géraldine Schwarz, we will hear later. And she's our special guest for this evening celebration of Yom HaShoah. Géraldine Schwarz is a French and German writer, as Rocco said before. She's a journalist, she's a documentary filmmaker. And after working for a long time as a German correspondent for the France press agency, she now publishes in various international media. We will talk tonight about her book, Those Who Forget, which is now available in the United States in paperback. This book has been translated in more than 10 languages and received many awards, including the European Book Prize in 2018. The book talks about the story of the three generations of the author, the German and the French family, her German and French family. And she deals with the personal and collective removal of part of the history that upset Europe during the Second World War. The book is an exciting and painful investigation into individual responsibilities and on collective amnesia linked to countries governed by totalitarian regimes in the 20th century in Europe. Géraldine Schwarz focused on the very important roles of the Mitlaüfer, I hope I spell it in the right way, this German word, Mitläufer, that means followers, gregarious, 10 of millions of Germans who became associates of Nazi crimes and the Jewish genocide. And through the comparison with the history of other European countries, such as France and Italy during the war, Géraldine noticed how they didn't face up with their fascist, communist, or colonial heritage. The author shows us that only the conscious elaboration of the past and the interrupted work of the memory will be able to prevent the repetition of the tragedy that have damaged the lives of millions of European citizens. Only coming to terms with the past will allow each country to ensure stability, democracy, and tolerance. It's an extremely nice book, and I suggest everyone who didn't read it yet to read it. And we're very, very pleased to have her with us tonight. So please, Géraldine, to you now.
Good evening, everybody. I'm in Berlin right now, it's freezing. Today there was snow. I heard in Jerusalem the weather is fantastic. I feel very honored to be invited with all of you tonight. I know it's a very special commemoration day. And thank you to you, Daniela, and to you, Rocco, and of course to Vashem for organizing this event. And hello to this wonderful public. from all over the world. Buonasera, bonne soirée, guten Abend. Unfortunately, I can't speak any Romanian or Danish, but you're all welcome.
Thank you very much, Géraldine, and I welcome you too. And also I thank Daniela for this introduction. So before we start, I just want to remind everyone to please keep your microphones muted. And also at the end of this conversation, we will open the floor to questions and comments from the audience, from you. So please use the chat function on the bottom right of your screen to write down your questions, and we hope we will be able to address most of them at the end of the conversation. Like Daniela just said, Géraldine, in your book, Those Who Forget, you start by telling the story of your family, specifically of your paternal grandparents. And the figure of your grandfather, Karl, is very prominent in the book. And your grandfather wasn't a Nazi, but not even an active opponent to the regime. He was classified by the Allies as a Mitlaüfer. Could you please describe how this term fits to your grandfather's behavior, and how this concept influenced the construction of the memory of the Shoah in Germany? Thank you.
Thank you, Rocco. Yes, maybe perhaps first I will try to give a definition to Mitläufer. In many countries, in the collective memory of war and dictatorship, we tend to divide the attitude of society into three categories: perpetrators, victims, and heroes. And in doing so, we forget a category which is absolutely central. And these are the Mitläufer. The Mitläufer are die mitlaufen, which means those who follow the current. They are not directly involved in crimes through their attitude of indifference and conformism, of cowardice, sometimes also of blindness. They create the necessary conditions for criminal states or ideologies. And the Mitläufer is not only a German figure of the Third Reich, is it actually a universal phenomenon, and it is not only a historical figure, but it is also widespread nowadays. And I wanted to write a book about the Mitläufer because I had the feeling that they're a bit forgotten in books and in novels and in films. And however, in my opinion, this category is very important to acknowledge if we want to learn from history, because it is actually the attitude of the majority of society to be a Mitläufer. And when people reflect about the past, for example, about the Third Reich, they cannot conceive being monsters like Hitler or Mengele, but they can imagine repeating today the mistakes of this mass of Mitläufer and become accomplices of criminal ideas. And so I wanted to write a book about the Mitläufer, and the ones I was legitimate to write about were the German parents of my father. I knew that my grandfather, Karl Schwarz, had been a member of the Nazi Party, and that he never held any official position under the Third Reich. But for a long time, I didn't dig deeper. And finally, one day, I searched through old folders in the basement of our family apartment building in Mannheim. Mannheim is a city in southwestern Germany. And among the yellowed papers, I discovered that my grandfather had taken advantage of anti-Semitic Nazi policies to buy a business from the Jewish families Löbmann and Wertheimer for a low price in 1938. On the picture you can see this is my grandfather in front of this building. which was owned by a Jewish family. So my first reaction was to go in search for these Jewish families. And finally, I found myself in a London suburb, sitting across from Lotte Kramer, a 95-year-old cousin of the Löbman, who told me about their terrible fate. The family Löbman and Wertheimer, after having sold their company to my grandfather in the hope to finance their exile to Chicago, didn't get any visa for the United States. And so they got trapped by the Nazis in Germany. In October 1940, they were deported with most of the Jews from southwestern Germany to a concentration camp in south of France. And 2 years later, they were deported to Auschwitz with the collaboration of the French authorities. One survived, Julius Löbman. He managed to escape the camp in France and fled to Chicago. On the picture, you can see the Wertheimer daughters who were married to the Löbmans. 2 of them died in Auschwitz. One of them is Julius Löbman's wife, the one on the left, and she died in Auschwitz. So after the war, Julius Löbman was alone in Chicago, and he asked for reparations to my grandfather for having been forced to sell him his company to a low price. And in the basement of the building of Mannheim, the family house, I found letters from Julius Löbman to my grandfather. My grandfather kept all the letters and also his own letters, I mean, copies of his own letters. So I could read what my grandfather had answered to Julius Löbman. And I was quite shocked because these letters are marked by a lack of empathy. He refuses to acknowledge his responsibility as a Mitlaüfer. He complains. He compares his suffering with that of Julius Löbman. Initially, his tone is correct, but seeing that Julius Löbman will not give in on his demand for reparations, my grandfather gradually becomes more and more aggressive. And in the end, he reverses the roles and presents himself as the victim of the Jewish profiteer, Julius Löbman. So I wondered when I discovered these letters, if my grandfather's attitude was symptomatic for the German society of the 1950s. And I found out that it was. Maybe some of you already know that after the end of the war, the German people rejected all responsibility for Nazi crimes. They blamed their leaders as if the people themselves only had been victims of a small group of criminals around Adolf Hitler. They were in denial that most of them had helped the Third Reich by being Mitläufer. So my grandfather is actually an example of the German society of the 50s. The Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, see here you can also see my grandfather after the war. So basically my grandfather had to pay, after 5 years of fight with Julius Löbman, he had to pay. But he never really acknowledged his responsibility in the crimes of the Third Reich, even if this responsibility was indirect. In the 50s, outrageous amnesty laws were passed by parliament in Germany. War criminals of the worst kind were pardoned. There was really a disgraceful impunity. And by the end of the 50s, there were hardly any Nazis in German prisons anymore. So myself, as a daughter of a German father, living in Germany, I asked myself, how did this country manage to transform this collective amnesia into the very deep sense of historical responsibility I experience today? And this deep sense of historical responsibility in Germany also allowed the country to build a very strong democracy. And I wanted to share the story of this transformation, and I think it could inspire also other countries which have trouble understanding that keeping memory alive is not a weight, but a wealth. So Rocco, do you hear me? Yes. I think you also asked me the concept of Mitlaüfer and the further development of the construction of memory in Germany. Well, it happens that not only my grandfather is symptomatic for the German society in the 50s, but also my father. But my father represents the opposite of my grandfather. My father was born in 1943. Here you can see him as a child. I guess he's 6 or 7. And he was part of the generation which pulled the German population out of amnesia. When he was a teenager, he told me that he started to read books which were almost forbidden at that time about the crimes of the Third Reich. And he also started quite early to confront his own father. And what he blamed his father for was not that he had been a Mitläufer, because my father always said, I don't know what I would have done. You know, it's always easier to blame people for doing something when you were not part of this era. But what he was blaming his father for was that even after the war, his father would not condemn clearly the Third Reich. So the generation of my father in the 60s, in the context of the students' uprising in Germany, started to demand that light be shed on the Nazi past. They revolted against the political amnesia and impunity enjoyed by the former Nazis. But they also started to question their parents, asking them, what have you done under the Third Reich? And it was probably not easy to question their own parents, but this intergenerational breakup was necessary in Germany to lay the foundations for a new democratic society, clearly rejecting Nazism. And so in the 60s was the start of this process we call coming to terms with the past. But the Shoah was not central at all at the beginning, neither in Germany, nor in other European countries, nor in the United States. All these countries, in a way, had a guilty conscience for participating in the Shoah, or at least not trying to prevent it. So people started to hear about the concentration camps, about Auschwitz, also through the Eichmann process in Jerusalem, and also about the mass killings of Jews in the East. But in the perception, in the collective perception, these events were not perceived as being part of a whole, of a monstrous project of exterminating the Jews. There was still a code of silence about the Shoah, and it was facilitated by Jewish discretion. There were so few Jews in Germany after the war. You might know that what awakened people's awareness in Europe and the United States was actually an American television series called Holocaust. It was aired in 1978 in America. And in West Germany, where 1/3 of the population, 20 million people watched it, the citizens were very shocked and angry at the authorities. And German society from that time was overcome by a really deep sense of guilt. And there started the second part of the construction of memory in Germany. And the key of its success is that the figure of the Mitlaüfer was central to this task. Why was it so important to have the Mitlaüfer central to this task of remembering? Well, because instead of blaming a system or the authorities or just a few culprits, it's an entire society which had to question itself, to ask questions like, how can a society become an accomplice to crime? And what role does each of us play in that process? And this helped to sharpen the citizens' awareness of this mechanism that lead us to become accomplice through indifference, through conformism, or like my grandfather, through opportunism, you know? And in other ways, you know, in other words, this kind of memory work helped sharpen the awareness of the citizen for their own fallibility, and to sharpen also their critical thinking. Many other countries in Europe did confront their role in the Shoah, but, and this is the difference with Germany, in many countries, the people themselves were not really encouraged to reflect on their individual and collective responsibilities. This is why the question of the Mitlaüfer, I think, is the key to learn better from history.
And I guess this is why then the process of memory construction in Germany is so specific. And also in your book, you give a very deep transnational analysis of this, of the way memory works, and you compare what has been done in Germany with what happened in France and in Italy and in other Eastern European countries. And now a lot of time has passed since since the war, and also the crucial years of the 1950s and 60s, when there was a lot of attention on the heritage of the war years. What is happening now today in Germany, and also in other European countries at the same time? Is this difference that there was at the beginning continues to be? Are the memories traveling on parallel roads, or there is an intersection? There are commonalities between the memory of the Shoah in Germany and in other European countries?
Well, you know, even Germany is not immune. In 2017, for the first time since the end of the war, an extreme right party, AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, entered the German parliament. And this was really a shock, because this never had happened in Germany since the end of the war. This party got 12%, more than 12% of the votes. However, it is important to add that this far-right party has at least 3 times more support in Eastern Germany in the former communist GDR, 3 times more than in the West. And there are several explanations for this difference. But to me, one of the most convincing explanation is that in the communist GDR did not deal with the Nazi legacy as the West did. The communist German Democratic Republic was founded in 1949 on the myth that it was the land of Germany's communists who had fought against the Nazis. So, whereas West Germans from the 60s, 70s, start to accept their culpability, their guiltiness, the East Germans persisted in seeing themselves as victims, as communist victims, or heroes. But of course, the German people in the East had been Mitlaüfer too. So it was a kind of national lie. And so there were a lot of commemoration, but in this commemoration, the East Germans were seeing themselves as victims, not as perpetrators. And there was no room at all for the Jewish victims of the Shoah, because they were competing, they would be competitor to the communist victims. And the way, it's very interesting because the way the GDR, the communist East Germany, dealt with the fascist past is symptomatic for most of Eastern European countries. During the Soviet period, Big Brother Russia forced these countries to commemorate the heroic Red Army, which these countries actually hated. You know, many of these countries had been allied to Nazi Germany during the war: Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. And so they were forced, so it was totally schizophrenic because they were forced to identify with the Soviet camp instead of taking responsibility for their collaboration in the crimes of the war, especially the Shoah. And this lack of historical accountability, which is still prevalent in some East European countries like Poland and Hungary, is led to, I think, to the situation that we acknowledge today. Countries, Poland and Hungary, where racism and anti-Semitism is raging and where the democracy is under threat. But also in the West, some countries still haven't faced up to all the shadows of their fascist history. And as we have many Italians today in the public, well, Italy is one of them. Italy was Nazi Germany's first ally, not only on a military level, but also ideologically. Very few of the high-ranking fascist leaders and criminals were put on trial, and no one was extradited to another country, even though Italy had committed numerous atrocities in the Balkans, in Africa. And today, there are virtually no memorials or museums, or maybe Daniela will correct me, or very few, honoring the victims of those massacres, or even recalling that Italy built hundreds of concentration camps. You know, who today knows in Italy that there were so many concentration camps?
There's a big removal about that, unfortunately. Too much.
So I think, Daniela, as far as the Shoah is concerned, there are many wonderful initiatives in Italy. I've seen that, I've experienced that.
Yeah.
Yes. But for the other crimes, Italy is in total denial, I have the impression.
Absolutely.
And there is also Austria. I think I heard Primo Levi saying one day in an interview that Italy was hiding behind the monstrosity of Nazi crimes in order to avoid remembering its own crimes.
No, it's a very long story, and that's not the place where to talk about. But Italy has a very special case because we won the war. It's a little bit like France. So we weren't on the trial like Germany because we won the war, even if we did so many terrible things. At the end, we were the allies.
Yes.
So that's why probably we can skip a lot of trials and responsibilities.
Sure.
But that's obviously a very long story to talk about. But
Yes,
that's really
yes.
one of the reasons.
It's definitely also connected to the Cold War, and there was no Nuremberg process in Italy. But this is, you know, a long time ago, and in the meantime, nothing has been repaired. This is more what I criticize about Italy, that still today, nothing has been done. So, and I think it's a mistake, of course, because there is no coincidence if precisely in these countries, populist or far-right parties and leaders that make no secret of their admiration of at least certain aspects of fascism are always back with success, you know. And it's also a thesis of my book that countries that avoid confronting the past are especially vulnerable to the rise of far-right nationalism. Nevertheless, even in countries like Germany, who have faced up to the shadows of history, learning from the past is a process that needs to be continually nourished and rethought, just like democracy.
Yeah, and that's why in your book you present a very compelling case for in favor of remembering and the work of memory. Certainly, memory it's a very fragile thing, and there are a lot of tensions crossing memory. One of these tensions is the relation that connects memory with history. And what I found very interesting in your book is that you give a very thorough historical analysis of the events. So there is, yes, the event of your family, of your grandparents, but then also you give the reader a lot of the historical background to insert this personal history in the wider context. I wonder, do you think there is a special connection? How can memory and history work together in an optimal way? Is there a way to diffuse the tensions that we have between history and memory?
You just muted yourself.
Yes, Rocco, we had.
Sorry, yeah. Is there, yeah, sorry. Is there a way to diffuse this tension between history and memory and bring them together to work for each other's benefit?
Yes, thank you, Rocco. It's I think it's a fascinating question. We could spend hours on that subject. For me, it was a heavy responsibility to write about the past. You know, how do you write about an era that you haven't lived through? You know, how do you write about people who are dead and who can no longer defend themselves? History has multiple faces. It's complex. If you want to really search for truth, it is necessary to overcome blind loyalty towards your own family, towards also your own country or people, it is important to correct prejudices you had and take others' perspectives into account. My grandfather died before I was born, so I never met him. And in order to know him better, I started by calling on two witnesses, which is my aunt, Ingrid, born in 1936, the sister of my father. And she kept excusing his father's action. You know, she would say, we cannot understand, we can't put ourselves in their place. They lived under a dictatorship. You had to be a hero to resist. Whereas my father, Volker, who was born in 1943, and is part of this generation that forced German society to face its past, my father was much less lenient. He said, I used to tell my father, what upsets me is not that, you know, you've done the Nazi salute, since I might also have done that, is that even today, you still don't recognize your responsibilities. And I reflected about these differences between Ingrid and Volker's perspectives. And of course, they are tied to their experiences. Ingrid was 7 years old during the war, you know, between 5 and 8. And she lived through the bombardments and also the poverty of post-war Germany, while my father was too old to experience the war. And I realized, you know, that testimonies are less reliable than documents, and they are filtered through experience, through emotion, through sadness, but also love and loyalty. And so I had to confront these memories with historical facts and to try to find answers to questions like how far was it possible not to be a Nazi under the Third Reich? You know, what were the risks? What did ordinary Germans such as my grandparents know about the Nazis' crimes, about the fate of the Jews? And the greatest difficulty was to assess the responsibility of my German grandfather. I wanted to avoid judging him, but what I know today, you know. And I also wanted to take into account the psychosocial, the psychological mechanism that form our attitude when you conform, for example, to moral standards, or when you are also manipulated politically, ideologically. But in the end, I came to the conclusion that my grandfather was not blind to the immorality of his actions. And the fact that anti-Semitism was the norm by that time doesn't alter his personal moral failure. So in a way, I tried to combine historical depth and emotional participation. But the historical context should not excuse an attitude. So both, for me, are not competing, memory and history. They are complementary, especially if we want to pass on this legacy to young generations. I think that to sharpen the awareness of younger generations, we have the problem in Europe and probably in other countries that younger generations are less and less interested by this legacy and this memory. And I think two dimensions are very important in order to get their attention back. first, it is important that they know the major history to understand its teachings on a very pragmatic way in order to use the past to understand the world where they're living and to avoid mistakes, to identify dangers, to shape the futures, all these things. But it is also very important for them to feel that they are linked to this past. They need an emotional tie. And I think this emotional tie can be established through family memory. Anonymous history, you know, the major history becomes something special and private. It becomes part of the family. Life is infused into an abstract past through the history of the ancestors, their pictures, their stories, the faces, the names we know. And perhaps some of these young people will then ask themselves, what does it mean that my grandparents or my grandparents made mistakes or suffered or made sacrifices if I fail to learn anything from it?
Yeah, and it's very interesting how you can use family histories as a way to connect the younger generations to history and make them feel that they're part of this chain that continues from generation to generation. And also I was thinking about the educational approach of Yad Vashem and the importance that it gives to Holocaust testimonies and, or, for example, personal histories. And these stories of individuals are very important as a gateway to the larger history, and it really helps, especially young students, to feel interest and to start investigating and studying those periods, not just
the witnesses, it's very important, but the problem is that many of these direct witnesses are dying, and so how will we pass on this memory now that the last witnesses are dying? And this is why I think maybe, you know, everybody has a family story. You don't need to have a Shoah survivor in your family. All families, at least in Europe, have, you know, suffered or were linked to World War II. So I think it's for me, it's the most powerful emotional tie, of course, with this history can be established with digging into your own family history. And this is something which can be done in the schools everywhere to encourage young people to dig into the history of their families.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to go back a second to the concept of, to this idea of fragility of memory. And I would like to bring here into the discussion a quote by an Israeli philosopher, Avishai Margalit. And Avishai Margalit, I'm just going to read it to be precise. Avishai Margalit remarks that memory breeds revenge as often as it breeds reconciliation, which is a very interesting quote. And I wanted to connect this idea of revenge to what is happening on American campuses and other public spaces where young students, young people are destroying statues or are dealing with problematic aspects of the past of their country in a very, I would say, radical way. And in a sense, this is also connected to the idea that, like you were saying before, that memory can be instrumentalized and politicized. It's not just the big politics of the Cold War, but also in a much more micro level, this can happen. How do you interpret these processes, especially the ones in the States, like this kind of iconoclastic fury against the traces of the past? Do you think there is something positive? There is some kind of elaboration. How do you see this this trend?
Yes, I mean, first, maybe on the question of instrumentalizing the past. Of course, you know, history can justify anything you want. In history, you can find the example for everything and its contrary. And you can use this intentionally, but sometimes you are wrong and it's not intentional. Because, you know, while I was writing my book, I realized that, you know, from the past, we only have traces. And between these traces, there are gaps, which we compensate through representation in order to give meaning to these traces, to link them together. And this is what a historian does. You know, he also compensates the gaps. So there is a form of fiction, a part of fiction, also in a historian's book. What is important is that this fiction does not serve a political or ideological goal, but a quest for truth. And before World War II, remembering history was always instrumentalized. It served only to glorify nations or to stir up revanchism or to sanctify heroes. And after 1945, the trauma of war, of totalitarianism, and of the Holocaust gave rise in Europe to a new ambition, that of learning from history. And until today, some people doubt, like the Israeli philosopher you were mentioning, that we can learn from history. But I have to cite now Aleida Assmann, who is a wonderful German expert of memory. She says, well, what else is there to learn from, if not from history? So actually, we don't have the choice. We have to try to learn from history. Contemporary Europe was mainly built on the memory of World War II, on fascism, on the Holocaust. That helped setting standards and concepts. So it is actually also a success story. Not only, of course, not everything was successful, but this learning from history helped setting standards of concepts like the genocide or like crime against humanity. However, to overcome this history of violence and build a future of freedom and of peace, this requires knowing. And this is the problem, you know. So the basic of memory is knowing history. So we have a common ground and we can build common norms together. But to have this knowledge, you know, you cannot impose it. A state cannot impose a memory or a culture of remembrance. That never works. It has to be a collective process. It has to be supported by a large number of actors who come from different social fields. Otherwise, you will not be able, through memory work, to establish enduring and widespread values. So this is why, this is the introduction in order to analyze the phenomenon of the destruction of statues of colonial leaders and slave traders. This is not enough to build a memory. And I think it is even worse. It doesn't serve the purpose of memory work. It only serves an illusion of justice. And soon after the statues are destroyed comes the forgetting, erasing the traces of history means forgetting this history. And this means missing the opportunity to use our past to know ourselves better, because this is the whole purpose of remembering the past, is knowing ourselves better as human beings. And the other thing also is the destruction of statues, even if I understand the anger, I totally understand the anger. Facing up to the shadows of history shouldn't be done in a culture of victims and perpetrators. It should not be instrumentalized, you know, to divide a society. But at the same time, as I said, I understand why people are angry, because it is revolting that so many countries like Great Britain or the United States still shy away from their history of slave and colonial times, you know, stuck in denial under the pretext, under the excuse that they refuse to judge the imperial past by today's standards. This is an excuse that I heard a lot in Great Britain. You know, we cannot judge, we cannot understand these times. And it reminds me a little bit of my aunt, you know, when she says we cannot understand my parents, they lived in another time. But beyond the complexity of historical contexts, there are actions that were as wrong yesterday as they are today. And so I think in order to open a dialogue, it is the first step is to apologize, you know, to apologize. It is to take the perspective of the victim, to take the perspective of the humiliated. And this only can help open a dialogue and overcome this victim versus perpetrated dialectic, to replace it with a culture of responsibility.
Thank you. I was just thinking while you were answering this question, also at what happens when there is a kind of a fight between memories inside one society. So I think one of the issues about colonialism, and especially in Great Britain, is the fact that for many people that was a good period. There is still a very benign image of British colonialism, and there is even some kind of nostalgia for that era. So there are these competing memories trying to fight for the public discourse, to take over the public discourse. So I mean, you're right that a memory cannot be imposed by states and by institutions, but then what happens when it's like there are two groups that each one with his own memory, and how can they get along? And so,
well, I wouldn't say it's a fair fight. You know, the memory, the colonial memory was suppressed, you know, has been suppressed for such a long time. The prevalent narrative in Great Britain, in France, it's a bit different. I think France started 10 years ago, let's say, slowly to face its colonial past, and especially the Algerian War. President Macron said 3 years ago or 4 years ago that colonialism is a crime against humanity. But in Great Britain, I think part of the British people identify very, very closely with the colonial legacy. And so there is this, this belief that if this memory of the greatness of the British Empire is attacked, the whole identity of the British people will be under threat. But I think this just reveals a misunderstanding of how important the process of dealing with the shadows of your history, of confronting them, is important for democratic maturity. And failure to have this dialogue, this openness, and instead to be stuck in denial, is ultimately more damaging than facing the past.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the European landscape is full of ghosts of the past trying to come out, and they're kind of reverberating in our present, and we do feel that, and it's important to liberate this past and come to terms with it. I have one last question, and then I really want to open to the audience, because I see that a lot of people are active on the chat, and it's a bit of a provocative question, because we've been talking about memory and the importance of memory, and also the work of history that goes with this memory, and so thinking that as human beings, we do need sometimes to forget. I mean, we cannot just retain everything, all the information that we collect during our lifetime, and sometimes it's good for us to forget. So, is there, I guess, is there something positive about forgetting? Can societies allow themselves to forget and not just always to remember?
Oh, but we do forget.
Yeah, but
you know, memory is not only plural, it's also alive. It changes all the time. My memory changes, your memory changes, you know, it changes as we change ourselves.
Very selective.
You select them, you sort out. Sometimes you remember, sometimes you forget. And also we change our perspective on what we have experienced. The perspective evolves according to the meaning we need for that past to make sense of our present. And what works for us as individual also works collectively. One country, Spain, took the decision to forget. It was 2 years after the fascist dictator Franco died. He died in 1975. The Spanish parliament in 1977 voted a pact of forgetting. I think it was named like this, in order to avoid dealing with the legacy of Franquism. And the Spanish felt, you know, left and right parties voted for this pact of forgetting. They felt it would help unite the society and build the future. And this may have been true at that time. In the first years after Franco's death, the Spanish society was very divided. So maybe in order to avoid a civil war, it was maybe the right decision at that time. But 50 years later, the country still hasn't faced its past. And the result is the reign of impunity. It's like Germany in the 50s, you know. There were no prosecutions at all for criminals of the Franco regime, for all these atrocities. And the victims were left alone, denied, forgotten, no reparations, nothing. And the divisions today in Spanish society also between Madrid, with part of Catalonia, which is, for those who don't know this conflict, a province of Spain which seeks independence. These divisions are linked also to this pact of forgetting. They are linked to the fact that Spain didn't face its Franco legacy. But most of the time, remembering and forgetting go hand in hand. For example, I said that European identity is based on remembering. But after the war in 1946, Churchill pleaded in a speech for a common forgetting. He hoped to stop feelings of hatred and of revenge, and he thought it's the best way to promote a lasting peace. So there was also a process of partly forgetting. It was also one condition of the French-German reconciliation. I'm French and German, but surprisingly, it was above all the common commemoration of the past, more than the common forgetting, that made the Franco-German friendship so strong. In 1984, you probably have these pictures in mind of German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and French President Frédéric Mitterrand, who spontaneously hold hands at a ceremony in the French cemetery of Verdun, where many French and German soldiers of World War I are buried. And this became an iconic and moving image, spreading a message of peace and reconciliation, not based on forgetting, but on remembering. And maybe myself, to finish on a personal note, myself as a daughter of the French-German reconciliation, I was very much inspired to carry forward the transnational commitment of my parents, for Europe, for democracy and peace. And in a way, I was inspired by a freedom which is not founded on forgetting, but on remembering.
Thank you for this answer. It is true that they're intertwined, forgetting and memory. We remember because we forget, and yeah, it's. So I'm going to open now. I see that the chat has been filled with observations, and I want to start with an observation by Patrick Gannon, who writes, it seems that Mitlaüfer could be considered like an enabler. Like, he gives this interpretation of the concept of Mitlaüfer. Yeah, do you think it's
sorry? I didn't understand.
As he translates Mitlaüfer as enabler, someone who enables.
Ah, yes. Well, maybe enabler is one step more. Mitlaüfer. There are many different kind of Mitläufers. So you have Mitläufer like my grandfather, who really was a Mitläufer out of opportunism. But there is also, for example, my grandmother. My grandmother, she was not in the Nazi party. She was not an opportunist, but she loved the Führer. She was fascinated by Hitler, even if she probably didn't understand anything of the ideology. And she also, we forget often that National Socialism made many Germans dream, like fascism made many Italians dream. And this shouldn't be a taboo, because this helps us to understand why there were so many Mitläufer, so people who were following the current, and by doing this, enabling the Third Reich to become powerful and to commit crimes like the Shoah.
Yeah. Then here we have a personal testimony by Stephen King. He talks about his wife. My wife was German, born in 1972, and I'm British, Stephen is British, very often says that she's distressed by the German guilt complex. She asks for how long should we feel guilty. Her father, born in 1950, certainly was part of the student movement in the 1960s, but my wife says she feels no personal guilt. Is this wrong of her?
No. No. You know, the work, you know, the work of the memory work in Germany was possible because of the guilt of this post-war generation. My father, he probably felt guilty for his parents, and this guilt was so powerful that it made it possible to change the society. So at that time, it was important. But nowadays, there shouldn't be a culture of guilt anymore, even in Germany, because this can frighten the young generation. And the extreme right party in Germany, AfD, very much plays on that feeling of many Germans that they are a bit tired of feeling guilty. So when they mobilize, asking for a change in memory work in Germany, they want to finish a memory based on guilt. So they are instrumentalizing the sentiment, the feeling of many Germans that they are a bit fed up with this guilt in order to gain voters. So this is why it's very important, in order not to play in their hands, to speak about a culture of responsibility. This is my I'm very much committed into that, to try to really change the perspective. We are talking here about the responsibility, and I think it is important as a German to feel this responsibility, which is not guilt, because in the end, you know, I am very lucky because I didn't have to do anything. My father did, and I live in a great society. I live in freedom, I live in peace, and so I am thankful, and I feel responsible for this legacy.
Thank you. Just reading, going through the chat. A lot of comments about Italians not being good people, as the legend says, and sorry. Just a second. Okay. Riccardo Caramanna writes, an Italian scholar, Valentina Pisanti, noted how the Shoah has been told for more than 20 years, and nationalism and racism are on the rise. Doesn't Géraldine Schwarz think that we can speak of a failure of the politics of memory?
Well,
okay, so despite this these years of education and
yes. Well, this is well, I wouldn't say failure. I think it's a bit strong.
Very harsh.
But it is true that we should maybe think of a new way of commemorating the past. Because in many countries, as I mentioned before, the memory was imposed. The memory work was a bit imposed by the state. For example, in France, we say devoir de mémoire, which is the duty of memory. So it is something which is forced on you. And it's not the best way to make memory work efficient in a way that, why is remembering important? It is important in order to understand today how we should behave in order that history doesn't repeat itself. So it is important through memory work to rise an awareness among citizens about their own responsibility, and to help them understand the world better, and to also protect themselves, protect their democracy, protect their freedom towards political parties or political leaders who want to destroy this democracy or the tolerance. And this is, unfortunately, most countries have tried to impose memory work on their citizens without thinking of how do you transform this memory work into critical thinking, because it's all about making people more intelligent. You know, this is it, more or less. But this is only possible if you address the responsibility of people in history. You know, the mass of people are absent from history. As I said at the beginning of the conference, we talk a lot about the heroes, the big criminals, monsters, the victims, but we forget this mass of people, the Mitlaüfer. And if you never actually acknowledge their role in history, then you cannot expect people today to acknowledge their role today in a democracy and their responsibility.
Thank you.
So there is hope. There is hope. I just think that it's important to address these questions in a different way.
Yeah, and there are actually very pressing questions, because a lot of people in the chat are referring about this role of memory and how we should connect to the past. Stavros Sfakiotakis, sorry if I misread your name, sorry, Stavros, asks, can states erase memory? So states, like can institutions erase memory? Is it possible that a state can erase a memory?
Erase, sorry, yeah. Erase. Oh, yes. I mean, it's happening right now in Russia. I mean, this is you know, as I said before World War II, history was used to glorify nations or to stir up revenge. So this is something which still exists. It hasn't disappeared. It's very tempting to take in history anything you need to justify your ideology or your politics. What Putin is doing, he's trying to satisfy everybody. So he rehabilitates the Tsar, he rehabilitates Stalin, and he rehabilitates the Orthodox Church. So everybody's happy.
From Steffi Fastlich, we have congratulations. I congratulate Géraldine for contemplating the importance of the collective unconscious, the Jung, to uncover history, accountability, responsibility, and empathy, but taking into account the particular context of the event. So this is interesting reading. And I have this. Okay, so Penelope Kumler writes, I have lived deeply integrated in Germany for many years, and the democratic, self-aware society Ms. Schwarz describes is not what I experience. Yes, there are those who consciously remember at least once a year Kristallnacht, but the majority also consciously ignores, becomes irritated by, and denies feeling guilt for its history. So there's like this, also this, I guess, like every society, there are those who
Sure.
who are committed.
No, first, there is this feeling that Germany has done its part. And this is why it is important now to react in order to change, the perspective from guilt to responsible, because many people don't feel guilty anymore. And second, there are also, and this is a problem you have in all the countries, unfortunately, younger generations who, don't feel connected with this history. You have this really everywhere, and also less, of course, in Germany, but still, because it's getting further and further in the past, it's distant, it's not your grandparents anymore, it's your grandparents. So it becomes very abstract. So it's important to find new ways to interest these young people, to make them understand that this history can help them shape their future, and this history, at least in Germany, the remembering is very connected to the strengths of the democracy. So if people stop remembering, the democracy in Germany will suffer. And to the comment about the experience, of course, everybody has different experiences, I mean, where is the truth? I can only say that by observing, the political system, the medias, and in general, the attitude of society, my feeling is that there is a deep sense of responsibility, and it's not always obviously linked to remembering, but for me, it is a direct, the direct result of this remembering, taking the perspective of the perpetrator. This is also, to come back to the question about the failure, the thing is that you cannot, of course, not congratulate Germany for having taken the perspective of the perpetrator, because it was the perpetrator. But as a matter of fact, it could inspire other countries who don't feel as perpetrators because they collaborated, but their atrocities are not comparable with Germany, to inspire them by trying to not to take always the perspective of the victim, which is very important because it sharpens the empathy. But empathy alone is not enough. So if you go to a camp, to Auschwitz, you feel empathy. So it's important, for example, for students or young people to go to Auschwitz. They feel empathy. But do they feel responsible? I don't think so, because they don't feel that they could one day be the one who morally fails and could contribute to something like this.
Thank you. I want to close with one last question, because it's already 11 o'clock here in Israel. And so Naomi Waxberg, because you talked about now responsibility, she asks, how does the feeling of responsibility actually changes behavior? Is responsibility limited to the borders of your own country? And so how then can we explain our Mitlaüfer attitude vis-a-vis what happens in other countries like Myanmar or Syria. So yeah, is there a limit to our responsibility? How much can we feel responsible for what is happening in the world?
Well, I mean, when you are already at war, or when you are already under a dictatorship, it's a bit more difficult to say no or to behave differently than the norm, because you might risk your life, you know. So, for example, in Syria, under the dictatorship of Assad, it's not being responsible, but it would be a hero, you know, to resist to Assad or to contradict the regime. So it's much easier to prevent. So it's important to adopt a responsible attitude in order to prevent a dictatorship or the destruction of democracy, freedom, and peace. There you can be responsible, and you don't need to feel responsible for the world. You know, you can also feel responsible for an unfair system, also economically, you know, by your behavior, how you consume. You can start with that. Responsibility should not be felt like a weight. It's also very empowering. I mean, I'd rather be a citizen which is accountable for something than just nothing. You know, if you give the people back their role in history, and their role is not only white, you know, there are shadows, but you give them back their role. They had a role. It's empowering. That means that you can change something. I mean, a Mitlaüfer, you know, we can, as a collective, as a citizens in a collective, you can choose if you want to act to participate in a negative way, like my grandfather did, or in a positive way. But the good news is that you have more power than you think you have.
Thank you for this answer. I was just reminding myself of something that I read during Pesach. Only a week ago, we celebrated Passover and the liberation of the Jews, and it's interesting that you are really free when you are responsible, where you take responsibility for other people. So I guess it's a very important message that like our responsibility for others also reflects our freedom and the way we feel ourselves. So I want to really thank Géraldine for this conversation. We really touched a lot of points, and the discussion could continue for hours, and I'm sure people will continue debating what we've discussed. And also, I thank you for the book that I read twice, and it's a source of new reflections. I also would like to thank Daniela Dana-Tedeschi for the introduction, and also for partnering in this event, and of course also all the participants, the audience, not just for their comments and questions, but also for being here with us and sharing this moment of reflection. So thank you very much.
Thank you everyone.
We'll have other occasions to meet again and reflect together on these issues that are so dear to everyone here. And I wish everyone a good evening.
I have one more question.
Yes, sure.
Yes. I would like to ask if anybody knows something about the Loebmann family and the Wertheimer family, which are the two families owning the company my grandfather bought for a low price in 1938. Julius Loebmann fled to Chicago after the war. He died in the 60s, but I couldn't find any relatives. And the Wertheimer family, they lived around Kiel and Strasbourg. So I'm sure there are many Loebmanns and Wertheimer. The Loebmanns came from Mannheim and the Wertheimer from Kiel. In the south of France, there is a concentration camp where they were arrested for 2 years. And after the book was issued in France, was released, the Mémorial du Camp des Mille built a building to remember these two families, Loebmann and Wertheimer. So I'm happy that they perished in Auschwitz, but at least their memory is still alive.
Thank you.
So
yeah,
in case there are
if someone knows something, please write to us, and
yes,
we can help Géraldine in her quest to find.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good night.